want to start before we start talking about the big issues about the phone-in, etc., with what you were like as a kid. So when you were a kid, were you quite shy, or were you one of these people who, in the school canteen, would do long, eloquent monologues about the Belgrano?
That's oddly, my hostess last night is a member of the Bulmer family, and when I was 10 years old in Chaddesley Corbett Village Hall, not that far from here, a Conservative MP called Esmond Bulmer made a comment about the Berlin Wall and how undesirable it was to have something like that in modern Europe. And at the age of 10, and I checked this because it was in the school magazine, and it makes me sound frightfully bumptious, but I put my hand up and asked why his government was supporting the idea of a hard border in Northern Ireland. And then 8 years after that, shortly after being expelled from my big school, I just realized last night that the first time Mum and Dad let me out of the house unattended after I got expelled was to come to the Hay Festival in 1990. And I'm back. So yeah, I was a schoolboy debater. I was, to paraphrase Christopher Hitchens, I was never shy about being thought arrogant or selfish, but I always enjoyed the cut and thrust of the debate more than I enjoyed necessarily the performance side of it. You know, I liked the arguing. I always preferred debating to doing the unchallenged speech.
And your dad was a journalist, so was news, the radio, were they kind of constantly on in the background?
Always late when I was a day boy before I started boarding, always standing at the bottom of the stairs shouting the time up to Dad every 60 seconds because he had to drop me off at the end of the drive at prep school, and it was a long walk. And if you were late, you got into terrible trouble. But we'd have Brian Redhead on the Today programme. We'd have every morning 3 or 4 newspapers in the house. I thought everyone grew up like that. I thought that it was just an unleavened diet of news. And my dad was a proper journalist. I'm not sure there are many left anymore. He was interested only in objective reporting. And he worked for the Daily Telegraph at a time when it was like a flagship vessel of international media, edited by Bill Deeds. And I, without realizing it, by a sort of process of osmosis, I just absorbed this reverence for that kind of journalism, and that's all I ever wanted to be. And when I finally got a foot in the door on Fleet Street, it turned out I was crap at it. I was just really, really bad at being a proper news reporter, because I always had this desire to share opinions, and my late dad would describe it as people like him were in the engine room and on the bridge, and people like me were Morris dancing on the deck.
Was it a conservative family?
My maternal grandfather was a trades unionist in the Sheffield Steelworks. My paternal grandfather was a publican in Leeds and a police officer. I think they voted for Thatcher in '83. But no, it was, I mean, my mum met Anira in Bevan through her father at a hotel in Sheffield, and I grew up hearing stories like that. Social justice was big in our family, and Christianity as well, actually. My dad was a very devout Catholic. When I was adopted, it involved my mum jumping through various hoops put there by nuns, many of whom she's yet to forgive. But I was very much brought up to do unto others as you would have done unto yourself, and I would like to think I still try.
And then you went to, is it Ampleforth?
Yes, that's Benedictine monks. That's where you get your sex education from men in dresses who've taken a vow of celibacy. It was interesting, and oddly, I'm a lot more positive about it now than I would have been 10 years ago. A lot of us have got back in touch, and I had a really good time. I had some astonishing teachers. I had an English teacher called Lucy Warwick, who writes for the TLS now, and she's had some novels published. And you have to grow up a bit, don't you, before you realize how seminal some influences can be in your life. And she changed my life. I wasn't happy. I had a slightly cruel housemaster. I didn't, by the time you're 18 and you're not allowed, you know, they still tell you what time you have to turn your lights out. At bedtime, some kids thrive in that kind of regimented atmosphere. I didn't, and Lucy ran the school theatre, and there was a green room downstairs where she used to smoke Gauloise cigarettes, and you could go and just hide there. And one time I came down, I remember, I must have been about 17, and my housemaster had ordered me to come and sit opposite him at lunch because he had some guests that he wanted someone to engage with. And I said, no, I'm sitting with my friends. So he threw me out of the dining room, and I'm all in pit. I just went downstairs. She poured me a glass of wine, which probably broke every rule under the sun, both the national and the school rules. But yeah, she just introduced me to Beckett and Flann O'Brien and writers that I don't think I would have encountered otherwise. And she opened doors that are still open today.
I mean, I read somewhere that it was called a Catholic Eton. In the sense of, did it give you...
I think that was my mum who called it that.
was there a sense that, did it help give you, instill a sense of self-confidence and a sense that you can do anything you want? An education like that?
It clearly gives you, I don't want to use the word entitlement, although it probably is the right word to use. I don't know how much of it comes from school and how much of it comes from home. I was raised to think that my sister and I could do anything we wanted to do, and we were as good as anyone. And again, I thought everyone was raised like that. One of the big surprises of the last couple of years has been the discovery of how deep deference runs in our society. I mean, most obviously with somebody like Jacob Rees-Mogg garnering sort of respect and admiration while talking almost undiluted gibberish in a patrician in a patrician drawl. So I don't think I learnt those kind of lessons, as in everyone has to listen to me. I'm born to rule. But oddly, getting thrown out knocked my confidence. It took years for me to realise that everybody else is mostly terrified too. My first job was as a gossip columnist, and I was at the National Theatre for one of Dickie Attenborough's birthdays. And they sent me down at first shift. I was selling suits at the time, and I'd failed to get onto any traineeships. I'd been turned down for every course, and I just couldn't get arrested. So I'm flogging suits on Regent Street. I sell a white suit to John Major because all the other tailors were off sick. So they sent me and another lad to Downing Street to kit him out for a European Union summit in Florence. I remember he dropped his trousers and said, "You see, I don't tuck my shirt into my underpants." It's true. And I phoned up the William Hickey column on the Daily Express and said, I've just sold John Major a white suit. And the Irish fellow that was running it said, I'll give you 500 quid for the story. I said, can I have a couple of shifts instead? And I went to do a couple of shifts. The first day they sent me to the National Theatre and go and talk to famous people. So as a gossip columnist, you go up to famous people who don't want to be disturbed by you and try and get them to say something that they'll subsequently regret. And I tried. The lift doors opened, and it is wall-to-wall household names. You know, Jeremy Irons, John Mills, all sorts. You name it. Ben Kingsley. Everybody was there. And the lift doors opened, and I looked around like this and thought, I have to go up and talk to these people. And the lift doors closed again. And I went back down to the ground floor, had a large scotch, went back up again, and still bottled it. I didn't talk to anyone. The only person I had the courage to speak to was Clive Anderson, because he was the only person in the room more nervous than me. And I went back to the office, and the editor had the photographs that Richard Young, the doyen of the paparazzi, had taken, and he just went through them one by one. So, did you talk to her? I went, no, I know. She seemed so happy with... Did you talk to him? I didn't want to disturb him. And we went all the way through. And my second shift, I'll be brief, but this is worth it, I think, because the next night was my last chance. I'd be measuring inside legs for the rest of my life. And I got sent to an Oscar winner's party at Elena's L'Etoile on Charlotte Street, this very legendary restaurant. And there was a rumour that Sean Connery was going to turn up. So I'd spoken to Jack Cardiff, a cameraman who'd won an Oscar. I'd spoken to Jeremy Irons. I'd got the guts because it was a smaller room and we were invited and it was a press reception, so there was no sense of intrusion. And then Sean Connery turned up. And I'm standing with all the proper journalists, all the people that have done it before. And he walks in and he completely ignores all of us. And they go off to do other things. And I think, well, I can't go back again and say I didn't speak to Sean Connery. So I say, have you got a word for the Daily Express, Mr. Connery? And he says, no. And he can't. and he walks up the corridor. And I'd done a little bit of research before. And I knew his son was playing Macbeth, making a film of Macbeth. And I said, have you had a chance to see Jason's Macbeth yet, Mr. Connery? No. He carries on walking again. And he's just disappearing around the corner. I said, what's wrong, Mr. Connery? Are you a bit jealous that you never got the chance to play the part yourself? And he stops, and he turns around. Can I swear? Is that if I'm quoting him? Yeah. And he hits me quite hard on the nose. Like, I played the part before you were born. Do your fucking homework, sonny. Thank you very much, Mr. Guy. And that is how I got into journalism.
I love the fact that you keep spooling forward, and I'm going to spool you back. So you've
Of
just
course.
left college. But then
Yes.
you go to uni. But am I right in saying that when you went to LSE, you were going to possibly go to drama college? That you wanted to you were thinking about possibly going into drama?
You've done your homework, Sonny, haven't you?
So in an alternative universe, would you rather have been doing Macbeth yourself?
No, I loved acting, but that was just the show-off gene. And Lucy Warwick, the English teacher, told me that I would be. I mean, I think I was quite good at it, but she said you'll get so bored so quickly. So the deal was with Mum that if I got a degree, then they would countenance the possibility of putting me through drama school. But by the end of my first year at LSE, the drama thing had gone out of the window.
So you do the William Hickey column, and then you're on the rights.
The showbiz editor.
The showbiz editor.
Yes.
And then you do is it the right stuff?
Well, then the news, it's very odd. The newspaper was owned by Clive Hollick, Lord Hollick, who was a Labour peer who also owned Anglia Television, and they were putting together this new morning television programme, which the BBC's media editor, Amol Rajan, after I'd left, he became the bloke who handed the mic. It's got an astonishing pedigree, this programme, considering it wasn't very good and it was on daytime television, and when I started, it was filmed in Norwich, live from Norwich. And they just
Sale of the century.
It was. They put together this panel, and I was supposed to carry on being show business editor, and then they realised that they were going to have to film it in Norwich, and I was working, 20 hours a day, constantly with the news desk at your beck and call. There's a certain Nokia ringtone that even now will send my stomach spinning, because it was always, when I said I was rubbish at being a journalist, I wasn't seeking sympathy or exaggerating. Every single night at about midnight, the phone would ring, and this mean old sod of a night news editor would be saying, the Daily Mail have got this, the Mirror have got that, the Sun have got that, why haven't you got any of them? And then the worst one ever, I interviewed Paul Whitehouse, and we'd had a few wines, and I thought, when I played the tape back, that he was telling me that the BBC, he wasn't going to make any more fast shows because the BBC hadn't put it on BBC One, they put it on BBC Two, and I wrote it, and they put it on the front page, and the phone rang at midnight, and so we just had the BBC on. That's not what he said at all. He was unhappy about the repeats being put on BBC Two, and the Mail have already run a page lead, completely knocking your story out of it. So that was what my life was like, which I mentioned so that everyone can understand why it was so seductive to be offered roughly a bit more money to work 1 hour a day on Channel 5 in Norwich. So that is the context in which working for Channel 5 in Norwich seemed like the promised land, and I certainly don't regret that.
So you started the phone in, what, 15 years ago?
About that, yeah. Sunday night was the first one. I took over from a chap called Mike Allen, who was a sort of radio legend, but he didn't present a phone-in show. He had a different type of a magazine show, 10 p.m. on a Sunday night. So the new owners came in at LBC and gave me this one gig. And at the time, after I left the Right Stuff, I was going to go back to newspapers, and my wife said, you're actually quite good at this, and you love this broadcasting lark. And if you go back to newspapers, you probably won't go back at the level you left. And it'll look like you've come back with your tail between your legs. And I don't think you'll be very happy. So look, we don't have any children. Got a relatively manageable mortgage on the flat. Give yourself a year to see if you can do anything in this line of work. And I got a foot in the door at LBC. Then it got bought, and then they gave me one show a week, but it was enough to keep the wolf from the door. So the very first one, the Sunday night, 10 o'clock, you go on air, something about Princess Diana, I can't remember what the topic was, and you reach the 10:15 junction, and no one has rung. And I don't just mean that 3 people have rung in, but they've got us mixed up with a minicab firm and a Chinese takeaway. Literally no one has rung, because you can see the switchboard in front of you. So come back from the 10:15 break, start again. 10:30, no one has rung. 10:45, no one has rung. And odd though it sounds, that's when I knew I could do this for a living, because I thought, if I can do a phone-in show with no phone, then there might possibly be some mileage in this. And it got to 11:10 when a phone line came up, and I thought, I know that bloody number. And my beloved wife, Lucy, who can't be here today, was on the phone pretending to be someone. And then my best mate, Luke, who's an actor, obviously realised what Lucy had done, so he rang in. And for reasons that I still don't understand, he decided to do it in a Northern Irish accent. Which he used to train his Northern Irish accent by going, "Hi, nay, Brian Kay, hi, nay, Brian Kay." And about 4 minutes into the conversation, he forgot that he was doing a Northern Irish. So and then after 6 months, they gave me weekend breakfast because the numbers were strong. And then 6 months after that, they gave me the slot that I've got now. And we haven't, there's about 120,000 people listening then. And it's still the best job. It's a very different platform from what it was then, but there's nothing else I'd rather do.
So what made you think, or where did you get the idea that like a genre which generally tends to be about let's try and wind people up, let's get everybody angry, I'm going to be angry about everything, you could do something different with that kind of shape of genre?
You make it sound conscious, which I don't think it was. There's another Hitchens line, isn't there, about never being afraid of looking for an argument because the grave will be silent. I'd love to say that inspired me, and that's why I'm so proud to be here today at the Christopher Hitchens Memorial Lecture. But I always loved a row. What I realised was that, what really helped was that I'm not a racist. So I didn't have to... I didn't have to go on
the minority.
Well, yeah, it's not as bad as it was, but that I don't know if anyone ever fakes that. Go on there, give me a ring and tell me why you hate foreigners. But you have to presumably have some sympathies for that worldview to share it on the radio. I had the opposite worldview, so it happened very naturally. The kind of people that were ringing all the other presenters would also ring me, and if I had to distill it down, I'd say I very quickly found myself much more interested in the why than the what. So if I ask you what you think about something, that's the phone-in tradition in a nutshell. It's very much the American model. I think this, I think that, I think this, I hate that. And all I started doing was asking why. And that's really that's kind of where it all started going a bit nuts.
And what's interesting about following on from that was when you ask the question about why, you then get a clash between facts and feelings, don't you?
Yes, you do. Oddly, the clips that go viral, and it's a relatively recent development, aren't that representative of the whole programme, because quite often the why is both positive and fascinating and lovely to listen to. But when it's a very strong opinion, quite a pungent opinion, and it turns out that people can't even answer the first question about how they've ended up there, that's when you find yourself pushing people to positions where they have little choice but to claim with a straight face that the reason why they don't like immigration is because they can't get to the till in their local Sainsbury's because there are so many immigrants in the queue. And you go, Jonathan in Bishop Stortford. You then essentially hold up a mirror of their own ridiculousness to them, and it's a great spectator sport, that, because it very rarely happens that people are actually asked to A, explain themselves, B, account for themselves, and C, explain the why rather than the what. So, and everywhere, it's not just callers to phone-in shows, it's politicians and newspaper columnists. They never have to explain why. All we ever get now is what. And all we do, or I ever try to do, is why, I think.
And moving, in fact, from the phone into more broader then, how culpable do you think the media is in more broadly, in kind of supporting that, in the sense that not just asking what can be quite more entertaining in a way than asking why, can't it?
It can, and of course, when you've got two people there, polarised, the why gets forgotten, because they're just trying to take chunks out of each other. And I think the media is immensely culpable. I'm quite frightened, actually, of the role that, or the position that the media in this country now seems to be adopting in pursuit of clicks and likes and pantomime conflict. It affords a false equivalence to quite fraudulent positions. So the example I always use is Galileo. If I, when I was presenting Newsnight, if I'd had Galileo sitting there with his Copernican theory of astronomy and his telescope and his actual charts, I'd have Nigelo Lorsini sitting here with his absolute certainty that Galileo is wrong, and I say, why? And he says, because I said so, and by the way, I've written a short book proving it. And I say, well, thank you very much, Signor Lorsini, but there's no way you should be getting the same amount of time and space that Galileo Galilei is getting. And you just leap. Briefly, I think the two, because I've been looking back a lot since Brexit and Trump and looking for possibly where it started, and I think climate change and vaccines. Climate change and vaccines were probably where we started putting people on a pedestal of equal stature to the science. And you'd get some idiot blogger who's just trying to make a name for himself, poo-pooing climate change. Or more sinisterly, you get people doing the business of the fossil fuel lobby, trying to poo-poo the science. And then the MMR stuff came along. And it culminates in in the Charlie Gard case, I think. It actually culminates in mobs outside hospitals sending death threats to doctors because right-wing provocateurs and fascistic media platforms have sought to denigrate expertise to such a degree now that people send death threats to doctors. And I think it is all linked. And I think that the role of the debate in the news programme is a very big, it's quite fresh for me. But I think it's the debate, not the news reporters, that have done this.
But you had a gig presenting Newsnight, and then you stepped away from it.
I did, and I mean, let's be clear. I've got a job on LBC that pays my mortgage, and you know, my kids need shoes. And Newsnight was brilliant, an incredible honour. And if that had been my main payer, I might have wound my neck in on the Brexit and Trump stuff, but I couldn't do both. So I was only doing 2 or 3 Newsnights a month. If I'd been doing 20, then I'd have had a different conversation with myself about where my career was going. But at that point, we're going back just over a year, I felt, and still do, that someone's got to say this stuff about Daniel Hannan and Jacob Rees-Mogg and Ian Duncan Smith and Amber Rudd and Theresa May, and someone's got to say it. And you can't say it on LBC if you're presenting impartial programmes on the BBC. So it wasn't a tough decision professionally, but it wasn't quite the honourable resignation that perhaps I've allowed it to be portrayed as.
But in terms of programmes like Newsnight, Channel 4 News even, the Today programme, do you think that template of journalism is no longer fit for purpose?
Yeah, I do. Increasingly, I do. And it is, I think it's the debate, again, that's done it. It's this desire to have heat instead of light, which, when I was in my dad's passenger seat listening to Brian Redhead on the Today programme, it seems to me that it's gone in a very odd direction recently, and that the need to have an argument, especially when it's moderated by presenters who, if they're on the Daily Mail side of an argument, seem to get away with murder now. I'm thinking specifically of John Humphreys, and I'm thinking specifically of 2 Thursdays ago, when there was an interview about the environmental changes that the country is going to potentially undertake post-Brexit. Just by way of context, there was an article in the Telegraph last week that I think sums up everything that's rotten with the state of British politics at the moment. Jeremy Hunt and Michael Gove had a joint byline on an article explaining why leaving the European Union would free us up to be more environmentally friendly and cleaner. And this appeared on the day that we were being prosecuted by Brussels for having filthy air in this country. So we have a dissonance now between what is published, respectable cabinet members, published in the Daily Telegraph, a newspaper which I have an emotional bond with for reasons I've shared with you, absolute hogwash. Not just a difference of opinion, but palpable hogwash. Proven by something on the news page, which says this legislation, which we enacted, the British role in environmental legislation, is huge. Essentially, we've done all the heavy lifting on bringing this legislation into play across the whole of the European Union, and we have fallen foul of the legislation and the regulation that we mostly drafted ourselves, and we are being punished for it. And on that day, the Daily Telegraph prints an opinion piece by 2 cabinet members pretending that leaving the European Union will make us more clean. And a week before that, at about 10 to 8, John Humphreys was doing a piece about this the previous week, about what Michael Gove says he's going to be able to do and not do. And he uttered the phrase, and the only reason I remember, I sat up in bed because I'd agreed the previous day to do a chat at the BBC that was under Chatham House rules, so I can't tell you much about it, but it was covering some of the territory that we're covering here. And I just sat up and I thought, I'm going to have to check the iPlayer because I can't believe what I just heard. They were talking about environmental legislation, and John Humphreys said, as opposed to what happens now, Brussels decrees and we obey. And I've checked because I'd just woken up and I thought I might have got that slightly out of context. Now, that is, for me, a sackable offence. If you're not allowed to present news programmes for the BBC from a position of partiality or opinion, then to say Brussels decrees and we obey, that is straight from the Daily Mail's op-ed page. It's demonstrably untrue, and it displays an ignorance not just of our relationship with Brussels, but specifically of environmental legislation across the whole Union. And And I think that probably is the best example of just how deep now that sense has gone of a certain opinion, a certain worldview being permissible in an ostensibly impartial environment.
And what's quite... And this takes us to this idea about the primacy of words,
yes,
and the idea of words, and when people use words like control or decree, etc., having to defend and define those terms.
Yes, sovereignty as well, being a great... And that's where I would start with all of these people, all of these shysters. I'd make them tell me what they mean. What does that... When you say control, what do you mean? We can't control our borders. Well, what can we do? Are you familiar with the... it's Article 3 of the Citizens' Charter, which says that any European Union member country can insist that citizens from other member states, after 3 months in our country, if they can't demonstrate that they've found work or that they have sufficient resources to support themselves, they can be required to leave. Almost every person who has used the phrase, we can't control our borders, in this country in the last 5 years, is either ignorant of that or deliberately choosing not to share it with people, which means any journalist who's allowed that phrase to be uttered in the context of a studio debate, we can't control our borders, and has failed to say, what do you mean by control, has unwittingly, I think, contributed to the crisis that the country is facing now. Because what we're discovering now is that all of these people who used these phrases genuinely didn't know what they meant. And that is why the Brexit, the phrase I like best is trying to take the eggs out of a baked cake. And now it is that those chickens are now coming home to roost. And of course, what we're seeing now is the utterly predictable, the dismal, the grimly inevitable practice of them all trying to blame anybody and everybody else for the mess that they've made. And I don't think they should be allowed to get away with it. But they will get away with it unless we all start picking them up on words like control and sovereignty, even political correctness. When's the last time you heard someone employ the phrase, it's political correctness gone mad, and then be asked what they meant? You ask someone what they mean by the phrase political correctness, and more often than not, within 2 minutes, they're trying to tell you, or you're pointing out to them, so you think we should all be more offensive to each other? Yes. That kind of is what I meant when I said it's political correct. So you want us all to go around being ruder to each other, do you? And they don't. Of course they don't. But these phrases have entered the bloodstream. They've entered the national vocabulary in such a... I mean, it's insidious, but it's also creeping. It's been a slow process, and now they go unchallenged, you know? Now the cake is baked.
You talked about how TV and radio become more binary and confrontational in terms of TV and radio debates. And one of the things I was interested in is, do you think that is just reflecting the way that society is, that it's become more binary and confrontational? Or do you think that actually that journalism is actually contributing to society becoming more binary?
I think it's probably both, isn't it? It'd be very hard to unpick it to source. But there does seem to be a footballification of everything at the moment. Is that you pick your side and you furiously defend it, regardless of right or wrong. And I use football as the analogy because, I mean, I support Kidderminster Harriers, so I'm rarely troubled by I'm rarely troubled by great events of great importance. But if you watch the big clubs on the telly, or you go and see them live, the hatred on the faces of the fans when a football kick has been taken at the corner it's been there forever. But it's when your side commits a foul and a certain type of fan swears blind that there was no foul. Even, you know, there's a bloke on the floor with his leg in pieces. And he didn't kick him at all, ref, or that was offside. And it cleared, so that ability, because your loyalty is so tribal and so entrenched, you can convince yourself that night is day and day is night. And I do think that sort of emotional process has crept into politics. I don't know what left-wing and right-wing mean anymore, but I know that lefty is now a terrible insult in the way that liberal is an insult, do-gooder is an insult. How have we let do-gooding become an insult? You know? And I don't know what we describe the other side as. Alt-right seems to be a popular phrase at the moment, but they seem to be trying to create a world in which no one's allowed to be decent. It's virtue signaling if you try to be nice. And I don't know whether that's because they're all sociopaths who don't believe that anybody else has a conscience, but I do believe that it contributes to this notion of you're either on this side or you're on that side, and we will fight each other to the death. And I would have laughed at someone else saying that a couple of years ago, and then Donald Trump happened.
What do you make of Question Time?
I don't watch it very often. I don't go on it. I think it's part.
It seems to have added to that, doesn't it? It's become
well, I think that's a very good exemplar of the problem. But I'm conscious of. I don't want to sound like I'm saying that, you know, other journalists and presenters are all wrong and I'm the only one that's got it right. I mean, Question Time is a brilliant thing, but it's about who you book. So I stopped doing Question Time when I realised that there was a very real risk of sitting next to Nigel Farage every week.
There's quite a risk of that on your daily show.
No, he comes on several hours after I've left the building.
The marginalisation of the truth that you've talked about, that's gotten worse over time. Is there an implication in that if people had access to the facts, they would all reach the same conclusion?
Well, it depends, doesn't it? No. I think there are, let's use Brexit as the best example. If we had been massively well informed about Brexit, then I don't think the vote would have gone the way that it went. But I speak as someone who voted to remain in relative ignorance. I didn't know about that Citizens Charter thing that I just complained about everybody else not knowing about. I voted to remain because I'm quite close to the racist rump with my day job. I know that I knew that the validation that a Brexit vote would bring to some really unpleasant people would happen, and it did. It happened almost immediately. But I also have very close friends and family members who voted to leave who don't have a racist bone in their body. It's very, very important to keep saying that, even though people pretend that you never do. People love to say, oh, you think everyone who voted leave is a racist, and you point out that you've said 100 times. You know, my child's godfather, my father-in-law, my oldest friend from school. He is Bill Cash's son, so maybe he's not a very good example of it. But lots of very, very decent people voted leave. But we were all ignorant. And it doesn't mean they would 100% vote to remain, because you can have a view of 19th century sort of trading practices. You can have a nostalgic, without being rose-tinted, view of England as an exemplar, as an exceptional country, or the UK anyway, because I don't think we'd have got much with the Empire if it wasn't for Scotland. But you just need an informed debate. It doesn't mean everyone is going to be led to the same conclusion. You can disagree about a fact, but we shouldn't be disagreeing about what is a fact. You can have a different view of the same fact, but we should all be starting from the same fundamental, objective foundations, which brings us back to the primacy of words. It brings us back to the importance of definition and making sure that these snake oil salespeople who it's Chomsky, isn't it? The slogan, once it make America great again. That's utterly meaningless. It's utterly fatuous. And good journalists went out and asked Donald Trump supporters when America had last been great. And it was comedy gold, because it's the goldfish moments that we all dream of when we're doing these interviews. And nobody knew, but it didn't matter. Build the wall, lock her up. It's vile. But it's the opposite of fact.
It's interesting, because in America, the places that have tended to do that has been places like The Daily Show or John Oliver. It's actually been the kind of, quotation marks, comedy shows that have gone out and done field pieces in that sort of subject rather than journalists, isn't it?
Yes, and I think we're different from America in the sense that because we're supposed to have an impartial state broadcaster, we didn't develop that. I love what Peter Cook said when he opened the Establishment Club in Soho. He said it's based on the cabaret clubs and the satirists of 1930s Berlin, because they did such a good job keeping the Nazis out of power. And I think that we've had a slightly different relationship with the news in this country from America, which is why we haven't got a subversive liberal media, despite what Paul Dacre lies awake at night worrying about.
Well, it's funny you mentioned about Paul Dacre, because you've said that you think that in many ways the country is governed by him.
Yeah, well, he had dinner with Theresa May. David Davis came back early from a meeting in Brussels to meet with him. That you know that the steel of the new Iron Lady, the man who wrote that article, is now Theresa May's spokesman in Downing Street. So if you were to be held to account in any other line of work, if you were to be judged by your actions in any other line of work, and you had described Theresa May on the front page of the most influential newspaper in the country as strong and stable and possessed of steely resolve and equipped with the gifts and the talents necessary to deliver a bonanza Brexit for everybody, if you'd done that in any other line of work, you'd never work again. But he got hired by Theresa May to run her communications office, and also in there is a former BBC man as well, who used to, I think, produce the Daily Politics.
One of the things I talked earlier about being described as the conscience of liberal Britain, but you've said that your politics are essentially Christian.
Well, yeah, I used to wince a bit when I said that. I don't anymore. I don't know why. I've grown up, I've been raised to look out for less fortunate people, and I'm not embarrassed by that. I don't think it makes me a virtue signaller or a snowflake or a lefty liberal do-gooder. It is a message I learnt as I was being raised in a faith. But I think it's perfectly easy and obvious that many people have arrived with a similar worldview that has nothing to do with faith, and I recognise that by even relating it to faith can be problematical because there's always sententiousness and judgment involved in religion. But I genuinely think that it's something everyone should do. You should be grateful for what you've got. You should try and help people who've got less. And you should probably be, if you're looking for a reason why that person there has got so little, you should probably be politically focusing on that person there who's got loads. And that, I guess, is a sort of form of Christian socialism. But
you started going back to church after your dad?
I did, yeah. Well, my eldest child was born. I was adopted at 28 days old. And I think this is the worst thing about writing a book, is you start doing self-examination on a level that I'm not sure is entirely healthy. So I'm trying to work out why I've got this sort of notion. I think it's because if you're adopted, I don't know how other adopted people feel about this, but you always have the conscience of the other life, you know? It's that Frost poem, isn't it? The road not taken, and I took the path less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. But when you're adopted and you're conscious of your biological beginnings, which in the context of what happened last night in Ireland is very, very pertinent today. I was a 15-year-old Irish schoolgirl, got pregnant in 1971 and had to come to England to have a baby, which was then given to my mum and dad. And it is absolutely magnificent. And if abortion had been legal in Ireland in 1972, I probably wouldn't be here today. But I'm still delighted by the way the vote went. It's an odd... I told you, this self-examination is very... I also appreciate that not everybody here will be as dismayed by the thought of me never having been born as I am. But what it means is I realise now, I had another life. There was the boy who would have been raised in relative difficulty, in an oppressive religious regime, without the benefits of a private education, without the benefits of two parents in a loving home. So I was always conscious of who I might have been. And I think that's part of my politics. That's got nothing to do with religion. So, you know, when you see politicians talking glibly and a little condescendingly, and sometimes using the people lower down the socio-economic ladder as cannon fodder to talk about them being left behind and then doing nothing to help them or encouraging them to blame immigration or the European Union or whatever this week's bête noire is. It's funny, you know, when I started on LBC, it was mostly single mothers that were responsible for all the problems in the country. They've had a great time of it lately. I hope the sites don't come back round again. It was single mothers and then the unemployed. It was relatively recently that the immigration stuff got revivified. It's hard to believe that, given how massive the revitalising of the racist scaremongering was. But there's always someone else getting blamed, whereas I've always took the view that the reason why, as I say, the reason why these people here haven't got enough is not because some people below them have got something, it's because some people over here have got too much.
It's interesting, I was talking to Robert Webb yesterday, and he has a line in his book that privilege is just a posh word for luck.
And this is the thing I don't understand. Before Charlton Heston went nuts with the NRA stuff, he was one of my favourite people because I saw him on Wogan years ago, and he was telling a story about coming out of the lot at Warner Brothers. And Jack Warner was coming out of his office, and Charlton Heston, who you imagine he folded himself into a car because he's a huge man, and so he's leaning out of his car and waving to Jack Warner, and Jack Warner subsequently told him that was the moment he got cast as Ben-Hur. and I'd never heard the word before, because Wogan, I was probably only about 10, wasn't I? And he said the word serendipity, which became my favourite word because I went and looked it up. And Robert's brilliant on this as well, because Robert's background is very humble. He had a tough time. It's a brilliant book. But it's luck. It is just luck. And that's, I think, what we are really in danger of losing sight of now. It brings me back to what I said at the beginning about deference. I can't get my head around the idea that people should know their place. I think, again, partly because I'm adopted, because of the life I've had and the life I could have had are so far apart from each other, that the idea that any of these barriers should be in place for other people, I think they're coming up again, these barriers. I think social mobility is declining. I think home ownership is declining. I think that It is, isn't it?
You must be very happy about that.
Yeah, it's great. No, but you don't actually hear it stated boldly as often as you should. And that's one of the things that worries me about journalism as well, is these simple things that I've grown up just thinking we're always going to be there. We'll do better than our parents did, taken for granted. They seem to be going away, and I don't think they would be allowed to go away if so many people weren't putting so much effort, again, into making us cross with the wrong thing, blaming the wrong thing for reasons. I haven't got a job, it's because of immigration. I don't get paid enough, it's because of immigration. Trade union. How can trades unions be bad if people aren't getting paid enough? And yet you go back to roughly around the time Rupert Murdoch bought The Sun and the Daily Mirror's slightly paternalistic treatment of a working class reader, a caring but paternalistic treatment. It just began to go like this. And then you end up with the Kelvin Mackenzie worldview, which is treat people like pig-ignorant scumbags and you will make a lot of money. And they still are.
It's interesting you were talking about that thing about the other life that you could have had and the sense of being aware of luck. Do you think that helps you in terms of when you're talking to people on the phone? Because what I've noticed is that even though you are challenging them and you're being quite robust, you still treat them with respect and you don't sneer at them.
Well, I do now.
But I think you do it in a measured way, though.
I hope so. I'm very glad you say that. I think I used to be a bit more. I used to be a bit of a dick.
You look more exasperated than pissed off.
Yes, because the news has changed, you see. So the stuff that we're talking about is dispiriting. You speak to somebody who voted to leave the European Union because he doesn't want to obey those laws anymore, and he can't name a single law. You want to hug him, not punch him. There was a time I wanted to punch him, but now I want to hug him because we're all in this together, actually. And he can't name a single law, and he's going to be worse off, and he doesn't know why. And the people that have led him to that position are still not being held accountable or responsible. Most of them are still in the cabinet. And that knits it all together, doesn't it? Because if it wasn't for The Sun and the Daily Mail, there wouldn't be a national conversation that has been increasingly toxic in recent years. There wouldn't have been scapegoating of Brussels and immigration in a way to persuade ordinary working people that their problems and the flaws in their life and their failures and their lack of success and achievement is all down to these mythical monsters, these dragons, Brussels and immigration. They've got away with murder. They have got away with murder. And we're not, I don't think we're on the uptick yet. I think it's going to get worse because what happens when Brexit is a disaster? Who's going to get the blame for that? Jacob Rees-Mogg or Romanians?
That was going to be my final question. I'm going to ask you one more question because I reckon there's going to be a lot of people who want to talk to you. But my question was just going to be, are you listening to these people, as you say, phoning in and being either frustrated or sad at that on a daily basis, do you ultimately just despair or do you find glimmers of optimism?
No, I'm optimistic. I mean, I have days when I despair. But again, remember, the clips go viral, but there's a 3-hour show every day. And there was a guy this week, I don't know if anyone heard it, a lad called Kieran, who drives a van. He's got a little haulage company. He does express delivery in and out of Brussels. He's sometimes on the Channel Tunnel, he'll go there and back twice in a day. And he knows more about the customs union than David Davis, Liam Fox, Theresa May and Jacob Rees-Mogg. We can still laugh, but this is true. He genuinely does. He knows what forms. So Daniel Hannan put some stupid picture on Twitter of a Swiss airport and then claims that we're going to have frictionless trade in Northern Ireland. And he believes it. I've interviewed Hannan a couple of times. It's like interviewing a Moonie. He believes it. And yet this guy, Kieran, a van driver, you know, the kind of job and position in life that the Sun would ordinarily be incredibly patronising about, while sort of tacitly suggesting that if they've got, you remember that Emily Thornberry picture with the St George's flag outside in the white van? That's so patronising and so wrong to treat these people as if they're kind of knuckle-dragging racist. He drives his van to Brussels and Paris every single day. He tells you what forms you need. And if we come out without a deal, if we come out of a customs union, if we come out of the single market, he's completely screwed. And he's already suffering, even though he's working working because he wants to buy another van for his fleet. He wants to give someone another job, but he can't because come March 2019, he doesn't know what day it's going to be when he wakes up in the morning. And the politicians who have put them in this position, one of them was speaking here last night, and they are still waltzing around the place as if it's some game, some sort of exercise in Johnson and Cameron's Etonian feud, Michael Gove's weird psychodrama about English exceptionalism. They're all still waltzing around. And it happens in March. It happens in March. And Theresa May still can't tell you what the plan is. And the only way they can get away with this is, to go back to the question you asked 20 minutes ago, because the Daily Mail approve.
Hang on, you were going to tell me why you were optimistic.
Yes, young people. Young people. In the United Kingdom, I don't want to kind of rain on my own parade. It's a different picture demographically in countries like Italy, but British people, young people in Britain, under 30, they'll sort it out.
Okay, hands in the air, anyone who wants to ask a question. Okay, so that guy there with the glasses. Oh, okay, whoever's, go up there.
Yeah. You've put across a view of the European Union, which is they're jolly nice people, and you've got a lot of laughs. What about the euro and the effect that it's had on Portugal, Greece, Italy,
yes,
Ireland, Spain? What about the common agricultural policy and the effect that that's having on African farmers?
Yes. The common agricultural policy's effect on African farmers is unfortunately another lie that you've been sold, because the anything but guns legislation, which the European Union has enacted for, I think, the 50 poorest countries in the world, there are no tariffs on anything coming out of those countries. I appreciate the newspaper you read has given you a very different idea. Similarly, if you go to any of the countries you've just mentioned and poll on the popularity of the European Union, it's considerably more popular now than it was before Brexit, especially in Greece. And all of the countries you mentioned have currently got higher economic growth than us. But thank you for the question.
Okay, so we're going to have you, and then you. Yeah.
You mentioned the non-racist Brexit voters you knew in your personal life, and
yes,
presumably from your listeners as well. What do you think were the main factors driving those, and also what do you think of the complete dysfunction of the opposition we're getting around Brexit?
I think that the portrayal, this is the Boris Johnson line about throwing rocks from Brussels. So after Boris Johnson got fired by the Times for making up a quote from his own godfather, he got picked up by the Daily Telegraph. If I sound bitter, this is because it was around the time I was failing to get arrested by any newspaper in the country. And after getting fired by the Times for making up a quote from his own godfather, he went to Brussels as the Daily Telegraph's correspondent and has said on the record, on tape, that he couldn't believe the sound of the greenhouse smashing when he started throwing rocks back to Britain. And I get that. I mean, mischief making is a lovely part of journalism. But what you realise now, if you look back over the 30-year period, was that Brussels has been portrayed almost unchallenged as a the gentleman over there is proof positive of it. It's the enemy. It's the Fourth Reich. It's the EU SSR. And this all went unchallenged because I think sensible, educated people thought it was all too silly to bother challenging. But by not challenging it, the educated, sensible people have allowed the floor to be taken by the Boris Johnson-style rock throwers, and now the greenhouse is smashed to smithereens, and none of us are going to be able to put it back together. Not Jeremy Corbyn in a billion years. The dysfunction of the opposition in any other period in British history would be the biggest story in town, wouldn't it? But it's not, because the government arguably are, well, talk about a rock and a hard place.
Okay.
Is it a fact that post the internet there are just too many facts, and the level of the debate is a function of everybody saying, I just can't cope, just give it to me simply? Is there, and it hasn't been curated, it pours out of every media office that is imaginable.
Is it facts or opinions, do you think? Because I wonder whether the rot set in when we started putting comments under articles on newspaper websites, because what that meant was that if you were the pub bore who everybody crossed the road to avoid, you could go on the Daily Mail website and put down your words of wisdom and you'd get 48 thumbs up, and you felt, and it looked on the screen, there was a validity to your comment that almost stood comparison with the article. It gave an injection of seriousness to utter idiocy. And that's the problem now, is that the utter idiots get as much time and space as the calm, informed, sensible people do. So that for me is the problem. More than there being a plethora of facts, there's too many opinions, but not so much quantity of opinion, quality of opinion has been degraded.
My question was about the curators of the facts, what we call the media between the fact and the person receiving.
Well, you can't
whether we've lost
Yeah.
trust in those, and whether there is any signs of a new curatorship or group of curators coming forward, and whether you can see people coming forward to say we can now trust new people, perhaps Wiki Tribune as the latest new kid on the block.
I hope you're right. I think you are. Again, I don't want to put too much pressure on younger people in the audience, but there does seem in this country, not so much in other parts of Europe, but in this country, there does seem to be a growing reverence for provable, for evidence-based facts.
I was going to say, the problem with curating is it smacks of elitism now, doesn't it?
Well,
There's this idea about everything being flattened towards...
Yeah, elite is another word that I think people should be forced to define when I'm not going to insist that you do.
No, I'm just saying... No, I'm happy to. No, what I mean is when you curate something, it's like, who are you to tell me what to watch? I can just go and see what I want.
Yes, but I think we need to step back from that, actually, and actually start respecting education again. I know it's an odd example, but I hope I've demonstrated why I use it. The Charlie Gard, the Alfie Evans stories are proof positive of how we now have given false equivalence to utter fatuousness compared to medical degrees. You know, the idea, Nigel Farage turns up outside Great Ormond Street with a film crew. Well, there's a child dying inside and the doctors are getting death threats. How have we allowed that to happen? And part of the answer, yes, does lie with media owners who are in pursuit of clicks and likes to the exclusion of truth and decency.
Okay, so... Yeah, and then somebody there, and then...
James, I think you don't just speak for liberal Britain. I think you speak for a far greater portion of Britain than that.
Thank you.
And if ever there's a need for a new political movement, it's now. Would you be persuaded to lead it? or at least be its communications director?
Macron.
Yeah. I don't. It's a very kind thing to ask. I'm just waiting for the grown-ups, mate. I'm waiting.
The country needs you.
I'm waiting for the cavalry to arrive. As someone, I don't think it could be me, really. I'm a mess. But I don't know. I've thought I'd have answered this question a lot more succinctly with a very simple negative not that long ago, and I can't anymore. Because where are the bloody grown-ups?
You've said possibly to rely on young people, but not that young. But what are we to do?
It's kind of the same question, isn't it, as the last guy? I think the starting point is those building blocks of objective truth. We have to start, and your younger generations have to start insisting on all the things that we've discussed today. So, you know, if you're a junior member of staff on a television program or on a newspaper, don't book Steve Bannon unless you're going to destroy him. Don't book Sebastian Gorka unless you're going to hold him to account for all of the lies that he's told. Don't book anyone from Breitbart unless you're going to ask them why they have a section of their website dedicated to crimes committed by black people. Just fundamental tenets of decency, which may not be as popular as stoking the fires of hatred. But if you start from these things upon which we can all agree, or if you don't agree that all people are fundamentally equal and that the colour of their skin shouldn't be a token by which you judge them, if you genuinely don't believe that, force them to say it out loud. Don't let them get away with the little illusions. Don't let them get away with the little suggestions. You know, I don't like people speaking foreign on a train. Don't let them get away with it. Pardon?
How many black people in this room?
Is that the same guy?
Yeah,
Okay.
May I speak?
Of course.
yeah, why not?
Oh, thank you.
And you're obviously speaking for all black people now, too.
I've done that for many years. original question was, when are you going to stand? But that's been asked. So now I have a statement to make. I've only listened to your programme once.
Oh,
I'm
and
now
that was
going-
enough.
I'm now going to listen to it regularly.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I just want to finish by saying your clarity is unique. Thank you.
Bless. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As a young person in the audience, thank you for laying out the tremendous task we have ahead of us.
You'll be great. You'll be sound.
I run a youth-led national organisation to get young people involved with politics, no matter where they stand. So I think that lays out what we've got to do. My question was, we talk about the people to blame for Brexit and for Trump, but to what extent do you think us Liberals are to blame for, that, Hillary Clinton was definitely, at fault for doing this, scapegoating anyone who does believe in, anything which is associated with the right as racist, as homophobic, which automatically distances them and, attracts them towards populist leaders. To what extent do you think we actually need to take responsibility?
It's a very good question. It's a brilliant question, and I don't know that you'll like my answer because I don't know. And the reason why I don't know is that I think there's two pitches, there's two playing fields. Because, as I mentioned earlier, when I state that huge numbers of people who voted to leave the European Union are just as liberal on immigration or on race issues as most of the people who voted to remain, the noises and the voices is the reason why I mentioned Steve Bannon a moment ago, that they don't acknowledge the reality of liberalism. So you're right to suggest that there's been a lazy reaching for the allegation of prejudice, but there's nowhere near as much reaching for the allegations of prejudice as the alt-right insist there has been. And what scares me now is that the Liberals, because we are accommodating and we try to be inclusive and open-minded, we're allowing the terms of engagement to be set by the liars again. So that is what has happened with Brexit and Trump. And with this culture war that some people think is in the offing, I think it's happening again. Because look, the Ku Klux Klan are marching again in America. So I think to suggest that there were racist undercurrents coming back to the surface of that country was both right and proven. I don't quite know how anything is improved by calling it out less. What you have to do is be certain that you're calling it out at the right times and hit people over the head with the truth when they accuse you of calling it out when you haven't. That again, because it's the thing that you say, it's amazing you can talk to these people without being sneering and without condescending. And but there are people out there, and they're powerful people, who are trying to portray everybody calling it out as calling everybody racist, and we're not. That's why I find your question troubling, and that's why my answer is not very satisfying, because the answer is, I think the premise has been incorrectly set by people who want to do, they want to get people to vote against their own interests, and they do it by portraying the people who want to protect their own interests as being the enemy. And that is where we are at the moment, I think.
We're going to have one more question, and that's the last one.
Yes, well, I'm not going to represent the whole African-American race, but a couple of things on that question was, yes, Hillary Clinton did say baskets of deplorables,
Yes.
but before that she said there are a lot of fantastic people.
Bingo.
So you have to take things...
That's a much better answer than I gave. So
But my question was around the new religion seems to be hypocrisy, because the things that the Republican Party are allowing Donald Trump to get away with, they complain when Obama wore a tan suit, not sleeping with prostitutes and paying them $100,000.
Yeah.
So everyone seems to be, hypocrisy seems to be the new way of saying, or what else is a more Republican will always say, well, Obama did it, but you hated it when Obama did it. So it's sort of like we can only believe what our guy is doing.
it's a denigration of objective values, isn't it? Again, it's the thing that we're playing on different pitches. America, much starker example than the UK at the moment. And I guess that leads us right back to the news media and the fact that you can have this false equivalence given to someone who is clearly lying. And they're on a debate with equal footing, equal respect, equal time, equal space as someone who is clearly telling an uncomfortable truth. It is, if I were to put it pithily, the people selling tickets for the ghost train are always more popular than the people selling tickets for the speak your weight machine.
So, now our time is up. Your book is going to be out in November, so you can so you better start writing it. If you can just join me in thanking James O'Brien.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you very much.